Hello and welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse on and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is presented in partnership with the Office of Sustainability. The Office of Sustainability positions the university as a model of best practices and a leader within interdisciplinary research to help individuals and communities understand the interconnection between humans and the environment and to address the urgent sustainability challenges of our time. We would like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. And today's forum is Prioritizing Equity in Climate Resistance Planning. Our panelists for today's forum will be Hokulani Aikau, Associate Professor of Gender Studies and Ethnic Studies and Director of Pacific Island Studies, Tabitha Benney, Associate Professor of Political Science, Kerry Case, Chief Sustainability Officer at the University of Utah, and Danielle Endres, Professor of Communications. If you have questions for our panelists, please enter them into the YouTube chat. And with that, I will turn the time over to Chief Sustainability Officer Kerry Case.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thanks to everyone at the Hinckley Institute of Politics for hosting this conversation today. I also want to thank Dr. Aikau, Dr. Benney, and Dr. Endres, not only for joining the conversation today, but also for their climate resilience and equity work here at the University of Utah last March. And as someone who's new to the university, I'm really heartened by the level of interest and engagement around climate, and more specifically by the expressed desire of many in our community to center questions of equity in that work. So I'm really psyched to have this conversation with all of you today. As we get ready to begin our panel discussion, I want to acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional lands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, affirming its commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communication and community outreach activities. We will have time by hearing from each of our panelists about their plans. So let's go alphabetically, which means we will start with you, Dr. Aikau.
Aloha, yeah, my name is Hokulani Aikau, and I live here, and so I'm coming to you from the Shoshone name for this place is Hokulani. We call it Salt Lake City, and I'm practicing that process of being more accessible in my presentations. And so I'm in a room with a brown background, and I'm wearing a beige sweater with my hair up in a ponytail bun, and I'm a light-skinned brown person, and I go by she, her pronouns. And today I wanted to talk, and I really want to thank Carrie for the invitation to be able to talk about this really important topic. I love to talk about, well, I'm passionate about this topic in part because of the work that I've been doing and thinking about how do we create and sustain a different kind of future for future generations of peoples. And when I think about peoples, I always think about them in the context of humans and other than human persons who also have to share this planet. And so, so the way that I approach this question of prioritizing equity is really from the perspective of prioritizing indigeneity and indigenous knowledge systems and indigenous practices. And again, recognizing that we're all on indigenous lands, and the peoples who are the original, who have the original relationship with these lands know how best to live on these lands. because they've been doing it for generations. And so two frameworks that I use in my own work to help understand what an Indigenous approach to climate resiliency would be are Indigenous Resurgence, which is a theory and method focused on restoring Indigenous peoples' relationships to their lands, to their languages, to their ceremonial cycles, to their histories. So restructuring a sense of peoplehood amongst Indigenous peoples, which is also about restoring Indigenous peoples' relationships to their land, restoring their land-based and water-based practices. So that's Indigenous Resurgence. And then also approaching this from an Indigenous environmental justice framework that recognizes that we have to attend to the full weight and scope of settler colonialism whenever we're talking about environmental justice and equity. And it also emphasizes and embraces the distinctiveness amongst Native peoples and their specific relationships to place, right? So what works in Hawaii, which is where I'm from, may not work here in Utah, right? Because of the environment is super, super different. However, there's some overarching values and practices and approaches that can connect us and that we can all sort of learn from, even though we're also paying attention to specificity of place and ontologies. So, Indigenous peoples have hundreds of years of experience with resiliency. As Dina Gilio-Whitaker argues, if we understand and frame colonization as a catastrophic force that exposed Indigenous peoples in the Americas to hazards, right, social, cultural, ecological, and genocidal, then the fact that Indigenous peoples continue to persist and thrive make them, by definition, the original climate resilience experts, right? And then when we combine resilience, the resiliency that it takes to survive genocide, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy, and we combine that with the generations of knowledge that live in places, then what we have is a wonderful sort of toolbox of experiences and expertise that we can draw upon to move forward into the future in, I think, a different kind of way than we are now. And so I want to share two examples from my research and my own sort of commitments to illustrate how an Indigenous, prioritizing indigeneity, what shifts that makes. And the first is a story that I learned from my student and colleague, Mechelin Cora Ishad, who is Balauan and works on land-based practices in Balau, which in her community and her context, those practices, the land is governed by women and the ocean and sea is governed by men. And she tells the story, and the purpose of me telling this story is to say that the current climate crisis that we're in right now is not the first climate crisis people have experienced over the long duration of humanity, right? But this is just one, perhaps, of many. And Indigenous peoples, including the Balauans, who a story I'm going to tell you in just a moment, they've remembered these stories and are telling these stories again because of the similarities between what we're experiencing now and what has been experienced in the past. And she tells the story of Uwab, who was the last born of many gods created from a clamshell that birthed all of the beings of the sky and the earth, and then also other gods and humans. And Uwab, as the last born, was tasked with the job of creating a governance system to manage all of these new beings in this place, in the archipelago, basically. And the values that were driving that process were respect and honor, praise and appreciation, compassion, cooperation and communication, good conduct and character, and unity. And because of these characteristics and values, Uwab was really successful in creating a governance structure that would manage harmoniously all of these new beings that were sharing the same space. But Uwab's appetite for food grew and grew, and he became insatiated. He could not be satisfied, and his greed just continued to. That greed needed to be continually fed, to the point where he grew so large that it was impacting the climate, and they were starting to see the negative effect of the climate. And so the people had to come up with a strategy, a secret strategy, because he's a god, so he knows everything, right? For how to deal with this problem of Uwab. And what they ended up doing was they ended up burning his body. And as his body began to disintegrate, it fell into the ocean, and his body became the new islands of the archipelago. And one of the actions that came out after that sort of event was that each village was instructed to build a bai, or a meeting house, in the center of each of their communities. And above the entrance of those buildings is the story of Uwab, as a reminder for what happens when they don't live by their values, right? The ones that were laid out before. And what I love about this story is that it has embedded in it the values that can direct us, if we follow them, towards an alternative future, one that is not based on collapse, or that emphasizes, greater inequality and injustice, which is sort of the path that we're on now. And it also says that there was a time in the past when there was a moment of crisis, and they found, and the people had the wisdom and knowledge and foresight to create a solution. So that's, again, one way that we can sort of think about it, and how Indigenous frameworks can be instructive for us. The other story thing I want to talk about is really related to my own individual research that I started about 10 years ago when I lived in Hawaii, when I was at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I was working with a Native Hawaiian nonprofit to restore wetland taro farming. But the cool thing about this program was about the restoration project was that it was in partnership with the restoration of a fish pond that was just downstream from it. And what the nonprofits had committed to doing, again, when we think about the values that drive our work and what values and principles we're going to use to make decisions, they decided early on that they would collaborate and recognize that the system, that the projects, even though they're structurally very different in terms of property structures that they're working within, and the financial structures that they're working within, very different nonprofit organizations, but the environment required them to collaborate, that no decisions could be made in the lo'i without consulting the fish pond, right? And the fish pond needed to communicate with the lo'i about what was going on, and they needed to think more upstream and up into the mountain areas as well, right? So thinking about a holistic system that's based on relationships, and one that doesn't just prioritize yield or natural resources or ecosystem services, but really prioritizing the needs of the land itself. The aina, as we would call it in Hawaii, as a living being that has its own needs and its own practices of care in order for it, the aina, to achieve its own fullness. And so I think that what I love most about these models or these examples is that the relationship is that it's based on reciprocity, it's based on relationships, and it's based on responsibilities, and not just from a human to nature perspective, but also honoring nature itself as an agent in this process, and having that voice be also present with us always as we move forward into what could be a more resilient future. So I'll end it there. That's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aikau. Dr. Benney, let's turn to you now and hear about the work that you're.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you to everyone at Hinckley for highlighting this important topic. And that's such a beautiful sort of conversation to follow. My work has and sort of my storyline in terms of equity and sort of climate resilience has been a long, winding road for me, but one that came from a place of truthfully a lack of awareness. And that's really what's sort of driven my path. Is the more my eyes have been opened, the more it's become a true passion of mine. And combining both equity and injustice in terms of equality with climate and environment has been truly a place of real importance for me, where I find the work I do the most rewarding. I think my real sort of, sort of love or sort of interest in equity and sort of that inequality notion really comes from, I would say, my undergraduate degree. I had always been interested in sort of supporting my community, but at Georgetown University, they require a lot of service, and you really get exposed to things that go beyond what you normally might be exposed to, including being required to live abroad. But they don't give you lovely places like Paris to live abroad, right? They really send you to unusual places because they want you to really live in a different place, to really understand the world in a different place. And so I spent a year studying abroad in Ecuador. The poverty that I was exposed to there, the inequality that I was exposed to there, even in my own home, was quite shocking, obviously. And, you know, I hadn't come from a very well-off background to begin with, but this was, you know, children living without shoes and without floors in their homes and things like that. And so it was quite overwhelming, and something that we spent a lot of time with children and things like that. And you really fall in love with them, and you really start to empathize in a much deeper way, having spent time, long periods of time with these people. And it was something about being absorbed into that society, not just being an outsider coming to help, but rather being a part of it, that really reshapes your ability to understand and to feel empathy for that sort of thing, I think. Then as a graduate student, I was, you know, studying political economy. I had fallen in love with this idea of equity and sort of the economic side of that. And my work led towards working in work around carbon markets and studying the clean development mechanism, which was part of the Kyoto Protocol. So I was lucky as a graduate student to go and do survey research in India. I actually traveled to 25 different states in India doing surveys in rural corners of India. And again, have this wonderful experience, both with seeing what we would consider living in poverty were able to do to restore the environment. And, you know, 100-year-old sugar factories running off of the waste product being produced in the field and actually powering the entire village around it. And I was shocked to find out that we weren't doing stuff like this in the United States. You know, that there was all this low-hanging fruit, so to speak, all around us, and that we were so oblivious and had lived in this bubble so long that we weren't even seeing it anymore. And that really stuck with me, that research, and again, living and seeing what the poorest people could live off of when we were sort of throwing those things away at lunchtime, you know? And those things just really cultivated this sort of interest in that for me. And as I did my dissertation, I studied capitalism, and really the underlying story that came out of studying capitalism in a variety of countries was those countries that treated people, the labor, well, did well with the environment as well. And I really began to solidify this concept in my own mind that, you know, if you can't take care of your own people, if you can't respect and appreciate your own people, of course you can't respect your environment, and you lose touch with that environment and the value of that environment. And so that has really propelled me in my research. That sort of central feature has become an important aspect of a lot of the work that I do as a political scientist who's heavily influenced by economics. I have the liberty of sort of adding the normative back into my research and sort of addressing the implications of us forgetting about the normative sometimes in the work that I get to do. And so I've been fortunate enough, I'm currently an advisor for the G20, for the Italy conference, for Task Force 2, which looks at climate change and equity in the global economy and how we can integrate that. I'm very privileged to be able to do research even locally, where we've been looking at vulnerable communities and air pollution, and really trying to focus the teams that I work with around questions of equity. So we always look at equity in the work that we're doing. We don't just measure anymore. We also look at what are the equity measurements that we need to think about. And so that's led us to some really fascinating work even locally on both medically vulnerable populations, student populations, even non-English speaking populations are prone to greater impacts and exposure from air pollution. And so we're trying to find these really important facets of inequality and structural inequality in particular, and trying to find out what those levers are in the research that we're doing locally at the Utah level, and even still internationally. How do we think about developing countries and help to think about equity and sort of the structures that we're building going forward, and not just the sort of Western power structures that we've used for quite some time that have largely been ineffective. Breaking down some of those tools and breaking down those walls that don't actually stop the problems, but prevent us from solving many problems has become a big feature of my work internationally as well. And so, you know, the more I think that you see this sort of thing with your own eyes, when you measure these things, you know, even quantitatively, which I often do, you see very clear stories about inequality, the cost that they bring to all of us. And they're quite honestly things that I feel can be resolved in some respects, that they're things that require us to use policy, to use economics. We have the kinds of tools to resolve these things. We just need to move forward often enough to resolve them. And it's funny enough that the technology is often quite ahead of the social side. The social side is really what is holding us back, I think, in many of these aspects. And so finding ways to use social policies to address the social aspects, I think, can be a really fruitful way and meaningful way to move forward. But taking baselines and understanding where we are is going to be required for us to be responsible going forward. So I've been really honestly privileged to work in this area, and it's really a passion and something I feel very strongly about. So I'm so happy that Carrie is here doing the climate assessment now around resilience. And so I appreciate your time, Carrie, and thank you again for inviting us all to this talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benney. Dr. Endres, let's hear a little bit about research you're doing related to equity and climate resilience.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Hinckley and Tabitha and Hoku, both. I'm really honored to be on a panel with both of you. So I also wanted to acknowledge, I'm in Salt Lake City right now, so I wanted to acknowledge the Indigenous land upon which I'm joining, and I encourage all of you to acknowledge the land where you're joining us from. You may not be in Salt Lake City, and so for me, that's Yoshona, Ute, Paiute, and Goshute land. And I also wanted to note that a land acknowledgement is one step in the direction of being more attuned and attentive to Indigenous resilience, Indigenous decolonization, and Indigenous sovereignty. So I'm a professor in the communication department with affiliations in environmental humanities and the GCSC. And I've been doing research on climate and energy for over 15 years. I come to my research from a humanities perspective. Specifically, I'm a rhetorician, a rhetorical critic, which means that I look at the way language and other symbol systems are used to persuade and influence. Most of my research looks at energy and climate controversies, and I really attend to the various stakeholders that are seeking voice in those controversies. Because I come to this from an environmental justice perspective, I tend to focus my research on the voices that maybe aren't getting a seat at the table, are trying to get a seat at the table, you know, those voices that are traditionally underserved, underrepresented, and marginalized in decision-making processes about the environment. I often also, but not always, attend to Indigenous environmental groups. So specifically, not necessarily an Indigenous nation, but sometimes an Indigenous environmental group that's made of Indigenous people from a variety of nations. And so I attend to the relationship between indigeneity and environmental justice and settler colonialism. But I also look at other groups that are not getting a voice at the table. That's really key to the research that I do. So I wanted to talk about a couple of projects. One is a very old project that I did many years ago. And this was, it was a multi-institution, multidisciplinary project where we got together to look at the Step It Up climate change movement. So if you know about 350.org, you at least know some of the players. Step It Up was the movement that started before 350.org by Bill McKibben and some students at Middlebury College. And so across the country, we had people analyzing this day of climate action that was put forward by Step It Up. And we did a lot of research about it. We were lucky enough to be able to talk to Bill McKibben and his students after the Step It Up event and kind of tell them what we thought of what was happening. But I think one of the keys that emerged out of that, and it's not a surprising finding, but was that even though Step It Up was really purporting to be attentive to climate justice and environmental justice issues, there were ways in which the discourse and the rhetoric and the form of movement organizing was still upholding systems of whiteness, upholding systems of upper class privilege. And so that was one of the really important parts of that project, and that anyone who's following kind of discussions of climate activism right now knows that those are still really, really important issues. So kind of attending to the ways that mainstream environmentalism or many mainstream climate movements may or may not say that they're attentive to justice and equity, but that there's lots of work to be done in terms of integrating justice and equity into mainstream environmental movements and climate justice movements. So my current research is on a concept called energy democracy. And this started as a social movement, and these were folks all over. We actually call it energy democracies, right? Because there's no one way to kind of advocate for energy democracy. These are groups that are advocating for our transition to different forms of energy to be as democratic as possible. And again, this is something that is happening locally by movements. It's kind of similar to environmental justice, where environmental justice started as a movement, and then there was some scholarly research that now kind of works hand in hand with the movement. And so, energy democracy is an overarching framework that I would argue is really inextricable from discussions of equity and justice. So the social movement itself is founded on environmental justice, energy justice, just transitions, energy sovereignty, and then energy democracy, I would say, is also fundamentally about climate resilience. The ongoing climate crisis demands a transition in our energy systems. And so these movements, and then the scholars that are studying alongside these movements, are really looking at this as a way to understand the energy transitions that we're going to go through, and to highlight democracy is really important to that. And then, of course, in addition to democracy, highlighting justice. The Climate Justice Alliance has said that transition is inevitable and justice is not. And so part of climate resilience is managing our energy transition. But unless there is a deliberate effort to center equity and justice, there's no guarantee that we will have a transition that is just and equitable. Indeed, history and the present often tells us that equity and justice will not be centered unless we are making deliberate efforts to do so. So in my own research on energy democracy, we're really trying to engage in those deliberate efforts. So that's what I'm working on now. I'm doing some case studies. I'm doing some case studies with Indigenous environmental groups that are promoting energy democracy on their lands. And then I'm hoping to do a project with my graduate student where we're looking at energy democracy in Puerto Rico after the hurricane and many natural disasters, which arguably were intensified by climate change, is really struggling with an energy future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Endres. I obviously, as you can tell, internet issues. How am I doing? Can you all hear me, or am I totally broken up? Okay, I've got a thumbs up from Tabitha there. It's always the day when you're doing a panel that your internet decides to be bad. So thank you all for sharing a little bit about your work. I think people listening can get a sense of why I'm so excited to be here doing this work right now, because of faculty members like you and your contributions. So thanks for starting us off with that overview. I'd like to turn now to exploring a little bit about what this looks like in the university context. As you all know, we're currently in the process of completing the University of Utah's first climate resilience assessment. It's part of fulfilling the president's climate leadership commitment that President Watkins signed in 2019. And it's an opportunity for us to identify places where the U is vulnerable to the impacts of climate disruption, as well as areas of strength that can make us more resilient as an institution. This work's being undertaken by a large group of students, faculty, and staff, including members of this panel today. And it seeks to create a baseline, like Dr. Benney mentioned, that allows us to plan for a more resilient university future. And as I began thinking about this work last spring, I reviewed the assessments of other institutions. And just as Dr. Endres said, as I looked through them, many or most of them placed their attention on sort of what I would call old school sustainability, environmental concerns, infrastructure solutions to the climate crisis, with little attention to issues of equity. And I would argue that as we move into a new wave of sustainability in higher education that elevates equity and views climate solutions specifically through that lens, we need to look outside of typical sustainability frameworks to find better models for resilience work. And thanks to each of you for your involvement in this reframing so far, or our resilience subcommittee, and or involving your students in this conversation and this work. And I'm incredibly grateful to each of you for that. I'd love it if you could now turn your attention to saying a bit about what role you think higher education should play in this move toward a larger conversation about equity and climate resilience. And please feel free to share any additional lessons from your own scholarship that should inform the university's work in this area. Anybody want to go first? Otherwise, I'll.
I'm happy to go first, Carrie, if she's helpful. So,
all right.
I think this is a really important question, especially, I think as time goes on, we've already started educating very young children about climate, about the environment in ways that are really important. This is kind of a funny story. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and she brought home an assignment where they had to cut out pictures of trash and glue them either to a recycling can or to a garbage can. And the funny part about it is that I actually do an assignment like that in my own class on environment. And I do it because it always makes me laugh that students still don't know where to put things in the recycling bin. And it's such a small thing, but most people, in fact, you will be very surprised if you go and look at the list of things that should be recycled and shouldn't be recycled. And it's there to talk about behavioral efforts and how we use behavior to sort of train people and socialize them and things like that. And what was interesting was that my daughter brought home this little assignment, but she had done it completely properly on her own as a 4-year-old. And it blew my mind, and it made me realize how important we actually are as a university for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, we are sort of the last filter, if you will, I think in some cases for people to really have this exposure. I think as people are younger and coming up, being exposed to this sooner, that's really important. But right now we have an opportunity to really socialize and make people aware of everything that's going on in the world around us. And so the university, first and foremost, is an important opportunity for us to reach people and to show them the importance of the environment and resilience and why it's not just about structures, right? It's not just about the planet getting warmer, but it's about equality and why we would want equality in that process as well. And I think the second big aspect of that I want to make sure I touch on is that the university should lead by example. It should be, we have this privilege that we should use for the best and most important things. And that is bringing equity and showing people how you can do green environmental energy projects and whatnot, but do it in a way that improves equality, not, gives it all to just one or two people, right? So we have this opportunity as a university to create these new, more equitable solutions, to scale them up because our university is so large, to be a beacon of that in our community, community. And I think the more we can do to show people how it can be both cost effective and equitable and improve everyone's lives, I think that is really what a privilege that we have as a university and as faculty in a university to do that, right? That's the one thing that we can do. So I think that's really the role, and should be the role going forward. And it really feels like the U is taking off in that direction and trying to be a leader in that way. And that again is something I'm very proud about. So yeah, I think that's a really important role of the university.
Thank you. We're trying, right? So Dr. Aikau, Dr. Endres, anything you'd like to add?
I can jump in, yeah. Yeah, that's great. I think, and I think I'll speak along the lines of other ways that we can model as an institution. And one way that's really important in my research is thinking of, and Tabitha mentioned this earlier actually, thinking of this as a socio-technical problem and set of solutions, right? So we often think of climate and energy in particular as, okay, we've just got to get the technology and then hooray, it will happen, it will implement itself, and that never happens. And so we need to blend our scientific and technical knowledge about climate with environmental justice and other socio-political elements, politics, culture, history, et cetera. And unfortunately, in many conversations, the scientific and technical are kind of the most important and are talked about first. And then we kind of get the social elements secondarily, and sometimes not at all. Sometimes we don't get to the point of even discussing equity and justice. So I think if we can, as an institution, see our climate resilience planning as a socio-technical issue with justice and equity baked in from the very start, that's a huge step, and that's a huge modeling. And I do think, to refer back to what Carrie was mentioning earlier, I mean, we are starting to do that. And I think that is something that is different from some of the other models that Carrie has looked at. And then a second point, I would just say that we need to, in our own institutional practice and our own decision-making practices, look towards environmental justice. And one of the things environmental justice says is that those that are most affected, that are going to be disproportionately affected, need a seat at the table. So we can do things like looking at how our resilience efforts, are we making an effort to reach out with faculty or student groups that are parts of populations or have strong connections with populations that are going to be disproportionately impacted. We can look at whether or not folks, who has a seat at the table in these decisions, and whether we're making an effort to center equity and justice in the people that are at the table making the decisions. And then finally, we can look at funding. How are we funding research? How are we funding initiatives in climate resilience? And I think centering funding, putting kind of resources behind research and initiatives that are focused on equity, justice, anti-racism, decolonization can be hugely beneficial.
Thank you so much. Dr. Aikau, do you want to chime in on this one, or should we move to the next question?
Either way. We'll just underline a lot of what has already been said, and perhaps just add one more thing, is that the other thing that I think about to add on to all of these other ways that higher education, really does situate us in a privileged position to be able to do a lot of this kind of work. I think it also opens up the possibilities for our students and for us with our students to take risks, right? Dr. Endres was saying, that we have other models. We can develop new models, and we have other models to work from, right? But we also, if we want to train, that we are in the business of training up and, a new generation of folks who will be doing this work writ large. And so I think that it also gives us an opportunity to help them practice what these new models might look like. and entail. Because if we keep doing what we've always been doing, then we're going to end up with the same thing on the other end, right? And so if we want things to be different, then we actually have to practice it being different, and get those new muscles working and learn new skills and techniques and perhaps listening skills when we're talking about bringing people to the table. We also might need to think about like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be bringing them to a table. Maybe we need to be bringing them to a mat, right? With oven in the middle. If we think about, culturally appropriate conversations, like where do we have them, and what does that sociality look like, right? And in that and then those moments, it's also about hearing in a different way than we're used to, perhaps, if we're come from, institutions of higher education and places like that. And so I love the privilege that we have to perhaps enact some of these differences and have the space to do that. I think that's what I wanted to add to what's already been said.
Thank you so much. And I think you all have addressed the follow-up question I had about some skills and what we really need for our students to know and to learn. So I'd like to go now to one of the audience questions that's come in, if that's all right, which is, what state and federal initiatives or legislation has moved your work forward? Is there any legislation you would propose to increase environmental equity?
I'm happy to take a stab at this. What has really surprised me is this notion of value, right? How we measure, or we even sort of calculate value in environmental goods. It's even beyond that. It's sort of how we calculate value in society, right? I think that we need to completely rethink that notion of value. I haven't really had the opportunity to sort of have something influence my work in terms of legislature, but I would say, I think more than ever, I think faculty are reaching out and trying to actually influence policy in really important ways now more than ever. I've never really seen it before to the extent that I see it now. We obviously have to be cautious about what we advocate and what we sort of get behind. And now more and more, I think we do have a strong relationship with the Utah legislature, for example. I do think they come to us and try and get research-based information to write good legislature. But I would like to see more of that sort of notion of value added to policy, where we think about the whole cost of something when we're trying to develop the policy, not just the short-term view, but the long-term view of that. And we think about the consequences of these sorts of things. When we think, for example, about the poorest children in our community who are already set back by their circumstances, living closest, most likely, to air pollution, right? These sorts of things have long-term impacts, not just on these children, but on all of us who as taxpayers, but also all of us as human beings when we try to respect each other and show, care for our community. We're really ignoring these things when we don't value them properly. And so I would love to see more of that notion of value brought into the idea of legislature here in Utah, being a state that has such a strong roots to, an Indigenous background and such strong roots to sort of these norms of equity. I think it is a really important facet of going forward, what we do as academics, but also something for us to think about in the policy realm more and more. And I encourage other people to do that, to try and bring those notions in or try and introduce themselves to local legislators if their work is relevant in this way. They're often looking for people who can talk to them and sort of give them more insights into the things they're trying to work on. So it is sort of a give and take and something we all have to work on as a community, I think. But yeah, I hope that sort of starts us off at least thinking about that.
Maybe I'll jump in to kind of build off of that. Obviously things like energy and climate can have a lot of legislation, and actually our state legislature is meeting. I don't remember how long they meet, but they're meeting right now, and they're considering a lot of different energy related bills for the state, and the state can play an important role in energy transition in response to climate change. And one of the things that that I often cue into is when I really try to look at the legislation is is this treating the entire state of Utah sort of as the same? So is this going to impact, is it meant to impact everybody the same? Or are there ways that the legislation is kind of understanding that we have very different needs among different populations in our state? And that to me often signals a legislation that is attempting to center equity and justice into it a little bit, because one of the things that we need to do for centering equity and justice is understanding that not everybody is affected the same way about impacts from energy, impacts from climate change. So that's just one sort of little thing that you can look for in a piece of legislation to determine how it's doing in regards to equity.
I guess I would just add that, but I think one thing that's just super important is that we just honor the treaties that have already been made between the federal government and Indigenous nations across the entire country and in Utah as well. And to recognize that Indigenous peoples have strategies and approaches to issues of, energy, conservation, all of these kinds of questions, issues of water, have strategies that could be implemented, but they're often not. They're considered. They aren't necessarily brought to the table, and I think that we need to be attentive to that, to those voices and those perspectives, and we have to honor treaty if we want to be just and if we want to be democratic. I think that that's a key component, is just to honor our responsibilities to Indigenous nations that have been codified already in law, and we just need to honor them as a first step, and then we can move from there.
Thank you all for your thoughts on that question. I want to turn to another audience question right now. One of the people list, is there a worry that perhaps action needed to address the climate?
Is this the question about too much focus on equity?
Yes. And I think
I'll just say one thing.
Required to address.
So Carrie, I think you're breaking up. So I think the question, okay, is about, right, like does equity slow down the process of change and transformation? And I would argue that equity should be at the center of any policy or program or strategy for transformation. Because if we were to create legislation and policy based on the needs of the most vulnerable in our population and our communities, then we would be benefiting everyone. When we create policy and legislation that only speaks to the middle class or above, those policies we can guarantee will not filter down to those who are most vulnerable. But the reverse is absolutely true. And scholars have worked on this and have demonstrated this to be true. And so if we really wanted to make great strides, we would actually focus our attentions on the needs of those most vulnerable and then create policy and programming around them, because that's how we all move forward together. Gosh, I sound like Biden or something. Okay. Didn't intend to.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I would take it even further. I think it's really easy to be caught in a bubble here in Utah to some extent, right? It's such a beautiful place. You really have all you need here to some extent. But, when we think about the value of that and whether, whether there's, whether we're overdoing it at any point, I think, so often we completely go the opposite direction in terms of what we focus on. We tend to try and go for the utilitarian, how many quantity can we sort of approach and fix, or how many people can we satisfy to some extent. But I think, without understanding the depth of how that almost drags society down, right? We tend to not fully realize how important that is. And in fact, if we realized and accentuated the opposite end of that, I think it would move us forward much quicker to some extent than, that sort of the status quo, which is to sort of be very utilitarian about it. We all benefit when we help the people at the bottom. We all benefit when we respect other people from all backgrounds. We all learn and grow, and diversity actually produces the best outcome. We know this over and over from qualitative to quantitative analysis. We find this with such regularity, yet we seem to sort of ignore it at the status quo public level to some extent, but we benefit greatly. And we know both environmentally, we benefit from moving towards a more green environment, and we know we benefit more greatly from moving to a more inclusive and diverse environment. That helps us at every level, at every kind of analysis. And so I think that we actually under-accentuate it extremely, and we need to incorporate it maybe more centrally as often as possible.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think there was sort of a follow-up question listed that's related to this, which is, if we have the technology kind of ready to go, but there's a group that's maybe saying we shouldn't do it because there's not enough equity in it. There's kind of this idea that that we can just sort of implement a technology quickly, right? That all we have to do is persuade people that that this is the right thing to do with climate. And so I guess what I would argue is we're already taking a lot of time. We've known about climate, we've known what energy tech, we know what to do. We have the technology, we have the science. So we're already engaged in discussions with people who are saying, no, I don't want to do that for this, and that reason. And so, I don't see that sort of viewing those that would bring equity to the conversation as the only objectors. There are already objectors to these technologies. And so to me, it's just so important that we include all of those voices into the conversation. And I don't think I'm saying this as articulately as I want to, but I really want to push against that idea that centering equity and justice slows down the conversation. The conversation is already slowed down by others that are objecting for various reasons. And, we just need to center equity and justice in those conversations.
Thank you. I'm hoping that my internet is coming better now. I'd like to go to another question from the audience, and it was asking specifically about transportation and relationship to our neighbors. But I'd like to ask sort of this as a larger question about how should the university be talking to our neighbors, be making sure there are seats at the table to promote equity as we're thinking through our climate solutions.
I don't know that this is just about transportation, but I think in terms of that question of how do we manage relationships with other parts of the community, I think that we need to start by kind of seeking out and listening to groups that are already active throughout the Salt Lake Valley or even beyond the Salt Lake Valley that are attuned to climate and energy issues. So we need to kind of identify communities that are already speaking on those issues. And then, Hoku mentioned this earlier, but definitely listening, right? And being open to what will result out of listening to what communities are telling us and asking us about. And so that can be one way to find voices outside of the university community that are already active and already talking about this, and then engaging in conversation with those groups. And so that could apply to transit, that could apply to energy usage, water, all sorts of issues.
I guess one thing that I would add to what does it mean to be a good neighbor is that it's about, relationships, right? And when I think about the work that I do, specifically working with, Indigenous communities on different kinds of projects, the first and foremost and most important thing is to build a relationship based on trust. And the reality is that, settler colonialism and some of these and the kind of extractive practices that have existed have really made it difficult for communities to trust universities. These have been exploitative kinds of relationships, and we need to put the time and effort into restoring and into creating new relationships based on mutual, reciprocity, and to rebuild trust. And that means showing up with communities in a particular kind of way, not the way that we've done in the past, in a kind of, extractive mode, but in a much more humble kind of listening and being ready to take guidance from them kind of a mode. And that definitely takes time and work. That's the one thing I wanted to add.
And I would just add to that, preparing people, we have to go out to our community to find what their actual needs are. And we often, as researchers, are taught to ask the question before we go out and do our research. And what we really need to be doing is be building stronger relationships with the community, and not just listening. I think that's the first step, right? But actually finding out what their needs are and trying to address our research to apply to real world problems as much as we can. We have this position in our community. They rely on us for a variety of things, but we rely on our community as well. And we want to be making sure our work is meaningful both to ourselves, our profession, but also to the larger community. And so I also would really encourage people to think that through as well when we think about going forward around this kind of issue.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. We have 2 minutes, and so we need to sort of wrap up. But I wonder if anyone, this is obviously a conversation we will all continue, right? This is where we live. But any final thoughts that anyone wants to share before we close out today?
Yeah, I did want to circle back to this notion of sort of what we can do as a university. And I do want to encourage people to think about the important role we can play in teaching each other how to work together. How to work collaboratively takes practice. It's like a language that we have to exercise. But people don't understand differences, and they don't learn how to work with differences unless we practice that. We all have a lot to learn from each other, no matter whether we're professors or whether we're people just starting out in the larger community. But there's a larger world around us, and we need to be responsible to that larger world, not just to Utah, but to this greater planet, right? We have one planet, it's a finite planet, and in being in a position like ours requires us to both lead by example and to take responsibility for that future. So I just wanted to make sure we know that's a big part of what the community is doing, and we think about centering that more importantly in our university community.
Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you so much. I think I'm frozen again. That's the theme of today. Thank you all.
Hi, Carrie, I think you're your video just froze up on us, but I will go ahead and end this. I just want to thank everyone for addressing our audience and sharing your work, your research, and how we can improve climate equity. We are so grateful for the work that the Sustainability Office is doing and that you are doing. And to our audience, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you at the next one.